And Dan has really, if you thought some of these thesis projects have covered a lot of terrain, you ain't seen nothing yet. Dan has, I think, alongside maybe one other student, been a relentless agent of stewardship, work, energy in this thesis studio. We don't in these gatherings get a chance to see the background work that you've done to research this project, and that too stands out strong and tall among all the thesis students. But I look forward to hearing responses and reactions to your hypothesis about how to help this community understand its opportunities, to translate its threats into opportunities that operate on a variety of different scales. And I look forward to having you unpack this for us.
Thank you. All right, so I'm Moreno Holt, candidate for Masters of Architecture, Masters of Real Estate Development. I'd like to start off by thanking my committee. They've been incredibly supportful and insightful throughout this process. The many community leaders and experts who helped me throughout this. My colleagues, Adam, Sam, Stephen, who helped me put this together. And Andrea, my girlfriend, have been incredibly supportive and patient with me throughout this crazy process. So this thesis proposes a plan for Salisbury, one that adapts in response to sea level rise, one that embraces the transformative power that climate change will have on our landscape and turns this, what's currently perceived as a threat, into an economic, ecological, and social asset. However, the thesis simply started out as a master plan for Salisbury. Salisbury is the largest town on Ireland's eastern shore, a regional hub, and it faces a threat of sea level rise. However, that threat is buffered, right? Water comes up the Chesapeake Bay and has to travel up the Wycomico, so it's not under the sort of threat that places like New York City, Ocean City face, that they are hit with direct storm surge. So it's a protected city. This shows the Wycomico River itself and its connection to the Chesapeake Bay. And you can see that what this shows is the yellow is riparian condition, red is seawater access structures, and black is a hard edge. And what's happened is the Wycomico River has been dredged. It wants to sort of take this meandering path. However, it's got a hard edge, and development has formed along its sides.
Salisbury is in the upper right.
Salisbury, I'm sorry, is up here, yes. And this shows what sea level rise would do to the region. And really what this shows is that there will be whole areas that will be completely demolished and will be no longer viable as communities. Zooming in, we see some of the trend. We also see that there's opportunities to capture some of the storm surge downstream. This is my project site, and these are the connections to other major hubs in Salisbury. Salisbury University down here. This is the hospital, Purdue chicken plant. And this is my site area. I'm trying to reach into the extensive healthy fabric, right, and transform the relationship to the riverfront. This figure ground, you can really see that downtown is in an island condition, created by two major highways and two prongs of the Wycomico River. And river's figure ground really shows this. Salisbury street network has several problems. Poor block dimensions. Streets that start off as major ways to get into downtown and sort of peter off and become anything. And Route 50, which was inserted in between two blocks and now creates a sort of mega street with building faces that are in excess of 250 feet. With the help of my parents, I did a traffic study. Thanks so much. Yeah, my brother. And what you see is really that there's a very little traffic through downtown, right? And this is one of the problems with downtown. And furthermore, working with the traffic expert, we also found that many of these corridors are actually over-engineered and can be reduced to lanes. So, one of the challenges getting into Salisbury is that all of these streets are very difficult to traverse and the pedestrian connections are very poor. Look at sidewalks and building frontages, and here you can see the manifestation of some of these poor block dimensions, right? An ability to engage with the waterfront. And bike lanes, poor connections into downtown for all modes of infrastructure. Looking at uses, we find that there's a lot of office space downtown, very few people living downtown. Furthermore, there's a sort of haphazard mix of uses, creating a sort of placelessness, a lack of distinct neighborhoods. Lots of impervious surface downtown. And working with experts, ecological experts on the river, I learned that this is one of the main causes of pollution in the river. And this is the opposite, showing pervious surface. Green space and trees, poorly defined streets, not a lot of tree cover along the riparian edge to improve the watershed condition. Also looked at major utilities. This is important to know when proposing new development, thinking about where streets might go. And there's some major, this is stormwater, and there's lots of stormwater from far off-site being dumped directly into the Wacomico River on very large pipes, some in excess of 8 feet. This shows contours, and really what this shows is that this is a city on 2 levels. Catchment basins and runoff. So what you can see is that there's a few locations where runoff is really accumulating and that should be treated and considered. FEMA flood map showing the 100-year flood. It's about 6 feet above sea level. And you can see over here, this whole low-lying area is under some very significant threat. Many of these businesses are already flooded regularly.
That takes into account the rising.
No, this does not. This is just FEMA map. So it's interesting because 6 feet above sea level is actually the projected 100-year projection for sea level rise. So this, in a way, shows what it'll look like exactly. Yeah, without
And the
flooding.
flood line is even higher.
Another 6 feet, right? Absolutely. And then this shows different levels of sea level rise. I focused on 3 numbers: 3 feet above sea level, 6 feet above sea level, and 8 feet above sea level. 3 feet above the sea level represents what climate change will bring us in about 50 years. It also represents a very significant storm event today. 6 feet above sea level represents 100 years from now. And then 8 feet will represent what a significant storm event will look like in 100 years. Then I categorize buildings by their opportunity for redevelopment. Are they the highest and best use? Are they compatible with what's being used in the area? And what I found is that there's an opportunity to transform the relationship to the waterfront and transform the relationship to this threat of sea level rise. And I looked at the history of the waterfront condition. When Salisbury started out, it was built along the high ground on Main Street and Division Street. This is that low-lying area that I showed you previously. And many of the areas around it were very sort of soft riparian edges, wetlands. This is about 1877. They took the major north-south street, Division Street, and created a dam for logging, and a big lake filled up the area. These were cranberry bogs up here on the north side of town. And this actually proved very useful because it helped me understand what the natural condition wants to be in some of these areas and influenced where I thought about including sort of a more riparian natural landscape.
We're seeing a railroad?
Yes, yeah. I mean, Salisbury was a major sort of trade hub for the eastern shore, right? A lot of goods would, because the Wacomico River was dredged, a lot of goods would come up the river, come down the rail. This was their sort of moment of interface. And as you can see over time, they really developed density along that area, right? And you have a lot of dense development along the waterfront and taking what was formerly a riparian condition, right, and developing along it because of the industrial use. But in 1831, the dam had actually collapsed, and they decided to develop in this low-lying area and continue Main Street. It collapsed, I believe, in 1915. And then this shows the condition today. Still a lot of hard edge, but not much reason for it to be hard edge anymore. Right? And this former density that you saw is now given way to a lot of parking lots, empty spaces. It's been little redevelopment in downtown in the last 50 years. So out of this process, I developed 4 principles that drove the thesis. First, to develop transformative responses to sea level rise, to utilize the existing assets in downtown to develop distinct neighborhoods, to reshape downtown arteries to improve urban connectivity, right, correct the blocks, correct the street problems, and create a 24/7 civic hub for downtown. And really this was about investigating what the first phase in development should be and how it can be catalytic, and this was the real estate portion of my thesis. What did I do? Hold on a second. So then I looked at, started drawing a lot of sections, thinking about what this riparian condition could look like. And these are sort of diagrams, but I also actually took them in real places downtown. And thought about how that condition might look today and how it might transform over time as sea level rise comes in. And how we can embrace that transformation. And maybe have a little fun with it too. Perhaps there's outdoor stages that turn into floating stages, and then I looked at different areas. This is looking at that area that's sort of facing some significant inundation. Probably have to put a levee in there, but that doesn't mean that you can't engage the waterfront. Right? You can build it into buildings, build it into pedestrian paths. And then I started looking at block typologies. How can we rethink building typologies and block typologies in order to respond to these needs? Open up to the water, pull up for protection, let the ground plane do what it needs to do, right, in order to bring in the water. And this led me to a couple specific strategies. This is a typical block type of multifamily typologies, right? Open up to the waterfront, switch to single loaded corridors in order to capture the economic value of the waterfront. Raise it up. And as you see, sea rise can do what it needs to do. Probably want to make these buildings a little longer for core efficiency. But many of these streets, the infrastructure will still be underwater, right? So some of these streets will have to be raised. And then we can allow the water to come in and have a more playful relationship with it. Looking at a townhouse type. Pull back to create more green space. Pull it up. We retain our defensible space in here, right? And we can use that elevation changer. We can create a clearly defensible corridor, or zone rather. And then cant it and open it up. And these reach down and come down to the ground, so the street's sort of reaching up, the building's reaching down. But then when that's no longer possible, when the landscape goes away, the building takes a much more dramatic relationship to the landscape. So, first phase of development. I thought this was really the place to start with developing downtown. This is the heart of Main Street right here. And this site, this existing parking lot, is a great place to start. The 2 streets that bookend it, also bookend historic Main Street, has great views to the waterfront. And it's all owned by the city, so acquisition is easy. So here, let me take a step back too. And really I looked at a lot of different uses. I ended up proposing a civic hub for downtown. I believe that this is something that can invigorate downtown with it competing with existing retail businesses and capitalizes on the existing assets of the place. So the existing condition, opportunities for redevelopment, and correct some of the block conditions, right? Looking at the water and looking at underground utilities, you start to influence a possible footprint. This is and we think about how we can protect against sea level rise. Some of the sort of west end of downtown is sensitive to it, so putting up a dam. Some roads will have to have temporary structures put on them. And then over here, I'm proposing a sort of elevated deck, right, that can also act as a levee. So finding ways to transform this infrastructure into an asset. And then this is the proposed future sea level rise sensitivity. and improving the watershed condition. And then this is the proposed uses for this place. They proposed a civic hub for downtown. Downtown is lacking many civic amenities, anchored by a civic plaza. This will include a new library in addition to Salisbury University's Adult Learning Center, which is located here. The concert hall, a hotel. Proposed uses. Here's a site plan. And here's a sort of NOLI plan showing the ground condition, and showing how it transforms as sea level rise occurs. This is a NOLI plan of the whole neighborhood, showing the parking garage, how it makes connections to other buildings, hotel with a restaurant. This is Black Box Theater, a concert hall. The library will include a ground floor living room. It's a double height space, and you go up to the main level, 21st century library. And then Salisbury University's Adult Learning Center makes a connection to a pass-through that goes directly to Main Street. This is the plaza will look like. And here it is transforming over time. It's important to recognize that these are changes that happen in different sort of temporal scapes, right? It can be immediate storm surge, but it's also long-term, right? So 3 feet represents a significant storm event today. It can also represent 50 years from now. But 8 feet at all times represent some sort of significant storm event. Here's a view of the plaza. And how it transforms. And you can see, I think in the future, our relationship with the water will be much more tenuous, right? We'll have to live in zones of ambiguity. Here's a section. Here it is all working together. Okay. Here's a view of that concert hall from the south. And then next we jump to the south prong over here. And this is the area that needs some sort of significant protection, right? This whole area is underwater. So looking at the existing condition, removing opportunities for redevelopment, correcting the block structure by removing the street. We sort of remove this sort of poor connection with the neighborhood and allow these blocks to make a more dynamic relationship with the waterfront and capitalize on that space. Here's sea level rise will do. And here's how we're going to protect against it. Propose putting up a levee. You might have to raise this road slightly and then put some sort of temporary blockade up here so the water doesn't pour back in after you do all this. Proposed contours. So we're not elevating that whole part back there, but we are protecting it from sea level rise through that levee. And then looking at underground utilities and using that elevated building to sort of to avoid hitting major utilities. The stormwater runoff is coming in from both sides over here, so we take these two streets and pedestrian corridors that connect to the waterfront and really green them and transform them into areas that can absorb the water as it comes down here, so you have to pump less water back up. This is the figure ground. And these are proposed uses. I proposed on the south side here, putting in a health and wellness district. This capitalizes on the existing hospital, which is just south of here, you can see. And has a health services school that's actually been proposed by Salisbury University, in addition to senior housing, events that might take place along the waterfront, dog parks, exercise areas, growing gardens, playgrounds. We proposed a retail district up here. Now that we've protected against the waterfront, we have an opportunity to build here and to actually build retail that actually meets the ground floor, right? Proposed uses. Exercise areas under the buildings, and eventually they may get inundated, and eventually they might be underwater completely. Next, jumping to the north prong, in the existing condition, large opportunities for redevelopment. Most of what's there is sort of underutilized industrial and retail. improving the street grid to provide connectivity from these neighborhoods back here and orient that street grid to the waterfront, and pulling this street back in order to create a larger area for catchment, for water catchment. Existing contours, we raised this to protect the neighborhoods back there. This is the proposed grid. That line, right, this line, becomes the edge through which two different building typologies express themselves, right? Over here you have more normal, more traditional development, and then off of here you have the situation where the water is going to come up and embrace the buildings, and we need transformative typological responses. So proposed use, proposed places, right? There'll be playing fields over here, and a small retail district down here. And proposed uses. Egress stair might turn into a way to access the waterfront in 100 years. They're parked. They'll go out after the storm. And seeing the whole thing in concert. And then jumping to Route 50. This isn't deal with sea level rise as much, but within the existing conditions, we take out the street, right, and create an opportunity for redevelopment, and turn it into an elegant boulevard which capitalizes on the many existing churches, playgrounds, museums that exist along the street that really don't manifest themselves currently because of how wide that street is. Proposed uses. And then jumping to the river's convergence downstream. This is a unique condition. This is the Purdue processing plant, which unfortunately is located right at the entrance to downtown. However, it's a significant economic asset. It's likely not going anywhere. And they're actually designed to be able to flood. So it's a unique condition, but flooding disrupts their operation. That's right. Get it all in the river, right? So it's a unique condition, right? They can flood, but they don't want it to be flooded on a regular basis. So what we propose here is raising the street and putting up levees, but these levees really only protect you up to 8 feet. After that, it does flood, and that's okay, right? And the few buildings that exist in here that are actually of value can be adapted over time. This is the proposed use. Some existing assets here, include a city marina and a restaurant that's heavily trafficked. A lot of times people will take their boats up the waterfront, go to this restaurant, so we build on that. Create a crossroads market that's literally at the crossroads of the water, 15 Main Street, and bridges this gap by actually crossing the water. And anchor it with a small restaurant that might also have a market function. And then up here, turn these industrial buildings on the north prong into a brewery and artist housing. These are proposed uses. So in summary, this thesis proposed as repairing Salisbury's disconnected condition for downtown, repairing arteries, and creating greater street connectivity, creating distinct places for this neighborhood and capitalizing on its existing assets, and embracing sea level rise and the transformative effects it will have on our landscape. And with that, I'd like to open up for questions.
Well, let me just start with saying that now I understand Professor Rockcastle's introduction. I mean, you really have taken on an incredible cross-section of issues within sort of one, but using as a kind of test case Salisbury, Maryland, which I think is really commendable. And a couple of things I really appreciate about your project or about your process. The first one is that you're really very genuinely addressing the concept of transformation in time. And I think, and we've talked about that a lot in the last couple of days, how does many projects just seem a little bit sort of frozen in one particular time period. And I think in your case, your whole argument stands behind this, the ability to create an architecture that has the ability, or an urban condition that has the ability to change over time. And that's sort of embedded in the design premise and the strategy, and I think that's fantastic. I also very much appreciate that on an urban level, on an infrastructural level, you're really considering two different types of making. One which involves landscape and transformation of that landscape, and the other involves typologies of building. And I really, so in some of the earlier kind of computer images of the transformation of the landscape, and one was clearly concerned with how that landscape changes and how the landscape might be modeled or manipulated to both accept but amplify change. And then there was the relationship of building, developing a new typology for addressing a kind of changing landscape. And I think that those are two really, really interesting points of departure. I think a bit about the Perez Art Museum that was just completed a couple of years ago in Miami by Herzog de Meuron, and they have this sort of, I think for insurance purposes, not just for flooding, but I think 18 feet is the number that's the closest that artwork can come to the ground. And so the whole typology of this building sitting in a park on PLOT, where ground plane is really called into question, not just in terms of being literally raised above the ground, but as a successive series of ground planes that are then juxtaposed by a series of hanging topographies, where so the landscape really completely engulfs the building. And it's a really, you might want to take a little closer look at that as a kind of, as an added typology, that you might bring to some of these projects. So to me that's fantastic. Then another issue you're also dealing with is, our waterfronts have been typically, or initially, as you showed very clearly, sort of primarily a kind of a convenient amenity, providing water or irrigation or industrial access or transportation networks. And you're like many American towns, whether they're on rivers or lakes. I live in upstate New York. We have the same problems of all Finger Lakes, where they were really not seen as places of leisure at all. They were seen purely as industrial utilitarian landscapes. And so this idea of kind of, as the term you use, of turning inside out the town, the city, so that it might actually regain or gain a kind of another relationship to that water as a result of its flooding, I think is a really opportunistic kind of strategy. So I really appreciate that. It's hard for me to know right now what are the infrastructures that exist, like for example the Wilmco Riverwalk. Is that an existing riverwalk, or is that an initiative that you're creating?
Yes, but it's sort of segmented in pieces.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm proposing to stringing it together and making it connect to sort of major.
Yeah, because I think pieces like that even might go beyond Salisbury would be really fantastic. It's a kind of much larger regional network of transportations, and I'm assuming the river is navigable now that there's no more dams, or is it minimally not navigable?
It is, and in fact, I didn't talk about this, but Salisbury actually is the second biggest port to Baltimore in Maryland. But all that activity takes place downriver, so it doesn't really affect what's going on here. But it's still dredged regularly. Yeah.
But again, I think the idea that, I just finished working with a thesis as well who dealt with Lower Manhattan, and instead of trying to keep the flood at bay, said, okay, let's embrace the flood. What can it bring? It can bring marshlands and oyster beds, and it can bring kind of leisure, and it can bring, suddenly Lower Manhattan is connected to Queens, and New Jersey become kind of essentially connective tissue. And it's, and creating a kind of typology, a kind of porous, literally porous landscape through surface runoff, through mediating the surfaces, through creating raised catwalks and elements that are perhaps expendable, but are also very much important to kind of create another way of inhabiting the city, I think is fantastic. So I really commend you. The question mark always, at the end of the day, and while I really appreciated your renderings, sort of the drama associated with the sort of, the water, the specifics of the architectural development seem almost that they're not as clearly rooted in a process, and it's not clear, where the vocabulary comes from, what the design choices that you're making. And I think that's a little bit of a danger in a project where you're taking on so much. At some point, either you need to kind of apply this a similar, not similar, but a kind of parallel process out of which the architecture emerges that might be more porous, might deal with orientation, might deal with environment, might deal with directions of wind, and so on. Which I think, within the scope that you've taken off, may be too hard to manage. So while I think it's maybe you put these things as placeholders, rather than designing them, because in the end, the design, I think, falls short of the ambition of the overall project.
Sure, I completely agree with that. But one thing I will say, I feel like the performance hall in some ways embodies some of the character of this thesis, in that what you have here is you have a sort of ground plane with sort of meanders and curves. Above it, the hotel, which you can see this rendering sort of perches through. And what becomes clear is a sort of distinction between the ground level and the program and what's happening above.
I think that begins to get at a really important part of the project moment, going back to the notion of landscape, or, things that are manipulated and molded versus things that are added and kind of, mediating that rising current. And, the idea that landscape, we call landscape, that the gray, you're just a kind of placeholder, but the gray in the drawing, they become the gray of the landscape. So there are really clear choices throughout the entire urban, what is static, what is rooted, what is part of that conceptual landscape, and then what is then either dispendable or additive or more sort of measuring the currents, So I think that's a really great instinct that you're bringing to the project, but I think it's still a little undeveloped.
One question before you. What would you build first phase if you had to pick?
Oh, sure, yeah. I think the first phase is absolutely sort of right here. And this was really the real estate thesis, so this was consciously the actual first phase. And there are a few reasons for that, right? You can improve the connection to downtown, right? These are the two streets that book in the historic portion of downtown, so if we can repair these streets, we can thereby repair downtown. It's all owned by the city, so it's easy to acquire. And I think one of the biggest missing amenities from Salisbury is the sort of civic plaza, right? So we have the opportunity to create that right here on the waterfront and in an area that already floods.
So the only comment I would have about that is that in these kinds of towns where there's not a lot of money around, the money tends to be in things like hospitals and healthcare. And just as a side thing, I think from an urban design point of view, you'd want to make that impact where you said, I agree with you. But probably from a development point of view, the likely scenario is that the hospital would probably do something first. They're the ones typically with the most money to do something, and oftentimes they do it badly. And no, they do. It's very common, that the hospitals build these gargantuan things that are very programmatically driven from the inside out. What's really nice about what you've done is in weaving the hospital into this, that actually today seems very far from the downtown, but by weaving it in and pulling it along the space of the waterfront, it would give them some very serious cues about how to be a good neighbor. Because in likelihood, if you could get more people working down there in the hospital, expanding, it actually would help support the development of other stuff.
Yeah, and that's sort of the idea for this district. And what I propose, just to touch on that for a second, because I did address the economic parts of it for the real estate thesis, is that this performance center would actually belong to Salisbury University. It'd be built with some sort of endowment. And so this would become sort of the way that the university can promote growth downtown, even though they don't have as much money as the hospital, for sure.
This is a very interesting thesis for many reasons. One of them is another thesis that actually takes a certain place that is currently depressed economically. There's something going on in this historic downtown, which is beautiful, by the way, which I wouldn't believe I would say this here in this thesis with so much information, but at least one picture of the historic downtown probably would not have been a bad idea. It's a wonderful place, and I always wondered as I walked over there, what's going on? Why isn't this place booming? It has an amazing regional hospital. One of the most modern healthcare facilities around in the state of Maryland. And I'm assuming that brings a lot of employment as well.
The biggest employer in the county.
And it has one of the largest industries with the Purdue chicken as well. So it has a multifaceted economic sector. Yet that downtown seems to be pretty empty. There's no car. On top of it, Highway 50 is no longer the main thoroughfare. Which was for many years. Before, after it was developed, exactly. So I find it very interesting that you are able to look at an impending disaster like this global warming and sea level rise and join it to this current depressed area and think about a prosperous future, which is amazing through urban design and careful surgical intervention of certain types of buildings, widths of blocks, and where you would build levee walls and not. So I commend you on doing this incredible exercise and for showing us the possibilities of what this could be.
I just want to say too that, I think this thesis all started because I'm from Salisbury, and I know I've met incredibly intelligent people. I know that there's a really rich culture there, and the built environment just doesn't manifest it. So I completely agree with what you're saying.
Well, terrific work, and of course it is a planning project, and I agree with Andrea's sort of yearning for more and fuller, consistent architectural development. But the scope of what you undertaken here is remarkable and is really well done. I think you could have looked at just selected one or two areas of this downtown intersection here, and that would have been plenty. But you've been quite comprehensive, and there's a unity to the vision here and to the approach that you could see evolving in a meaningful way over the course of 100 years. And the other thing you've done as a planner, what you've really done is equipped the architects to come along and design the buildings. You've given them a framework and an approach and a plan and a vision that would enable architects to arrive and design your concert hall, design your hotel, design your other civic structures in a way that would be responsive and would bring them together in a unified way over time. And I think that's one of our fundamental goals as planners, is to equip future designers with a framework, a unifying framework. So really excellent. The other interesting thing, in these transition images, it used the word ambiguity to talk about our relationship with the water in the future. And I think you've illustrated that well. There's an interesting little condition at York College in Pennsylvania where a small campus drive traverses a creek, but it doesn't traverse it by means of a bridge. It's actually a wash. And so when it's not a flood condition, this creek is actually washing over a concrete passage that the campus drive moves through. Of course, it's closed in a flood condition, but it's really interesting how that those kinds of ambiguous conditions are going to become more prevalent, particularly in places like this, where we begin to live dynamically with the changing conditions of the geography and hydrology.
And I think that there's probably a whole other thesis devoted to what do we do to our infrastructure to make it embrace this ambiguity. I didn't get to that, but.
Well, I think I'll start with a similar comment I had with Taylor. I'm just incredibly excited that we have our graduates looking at these kinds of problems and really trying to apply the lens of architecture and real estate development in really specific and meaningful ways to say, how can we solve the problem here? I think in much of our society there's a reaction to ignore the problem and the rains are never going to come, or let's put ourselves behind a bunch of levees and hope that we can survive the floods. And this is a much more reasoned, analytic approach that I'm really glad that you took the different conditions and didn't just settle on one or look at it broadly. You kind of went into a necessary level of detail to say, here's specific solutions. And levees sometimes are the answer. Wetlands sometimes are the answer. Pilotis sometimes are the answer. So I just think it's great to see in the range of all the theses. But in this one in particular, I think, again, the restraint, similar to what we saw with Valerie, that you had the restraint to say, it's not so important what the building looks like, and I'm not able to get to that level here. I am staying at this kind of planning level, and I think the rationale you had through the real estate development, that I have to look at this, what's viable, what's doable, and just to come up with fantastical ideas that challenge reality and things down to the utility lines that you were kind of respecting and trying to work within the existing infrastructure. I think that the vision for these kinds of places is a lot of what architectural practice needs to do, is help people and communities. Professor Bell mentioned about the hospital. and they're solving other problems that they wouldn't necessarily stop to think, like, what else could I do? And the idea that, the site could be an interesting pitch to say, what if the hospital developed this and had this wonderful public plaza, and this largest employer, this civic institution, this economic engine in our community could also be this other thing. I think it's just great, the kinds of questions you're asking, and the thought that hopefully this provokes, not just with you, but your colleagues in whatever professional practice you find yourself in years down the road. So thank you for bringing this to our attention. Thank you.
She's reaching. She's reaching.
I just want to build on that, and something that I've been thinking about with all of these projects. So first of all, the notion that these kind of challenges really require us to build partnerships with a lot of different kinds of stakeholders, that they're too complex for a single solution to solve the problem, and a single stakeholder to take it on. And that actually, we've seen this in a number of projects, and I really appreciate that, and I think that the fact that we're talking about this and seeing projects that are building that into your thinking is really, makes me very optimistic. In this particular case, many people know here that we have the good fortune to have a graduate of the program who's an architect, who's the mayor of this town. So that fact, together with your good work, Daniel, means that these drawings may come in front of somebody who is very likely to come in front of who will appreciate the need for taking action here and appreciate the gift of a framework to start addressing it. So you have that handed to you.
I'm going to give him a call.
But I think we have for everybody else, those of you who are about to do thesis and those of you who are just finishing and doing, whether it's the real estate programs work or architecture's programs work, I think there's a challenge that this work doesn't stay in this room. That this work has legs either as prototype projects that get published or as going back to those communities, and that's a place where we would love your ideas because perhaps we as faculty can help you do a better job with that. There's too many good ideas here for it just to be the things that those of us who happen to be here on this day get to see.
Just to build
I just want to add one thing here to that conversation. I think that's really important, the point Renee just made, because part of the service we can provide is helping towns like this think of a different future because oftentimes what happens is that the town is understaffed and overwhelmed, and they don't have enough kind of resources to really address all the things going on. And I think we really need to get with the mayor and show this. And I think one of the big virtues of this is, just to sort of push back on a distinction you made earlier, I think the virtue of this is that it's not planning or architecture. It's all the same thing. It's just at a different scale. And the fact that you can operate at the scale of the whole town and give us senses of what imageable public buildings ought to look like along the waterfront speaks to me of a kind of seamlessness in your thought process, Dan, which I think is really important. It's not one or the other. We don't plan it so that somebody else can design it. We plan it so that it can be designed. And it's just a different scale. And in this case, it's the scale of the whole city. It's the scale of the landscape. But in actual fact, I admire a great deal that you're giving us an idea of what the character of some of these buildings ought to be like, even though you didn't go through and design all of them. It's really clear that you know enough about the typology to be able to sort of have a sense about what the imperative in that direction might be. And I think that's really an important skill for architects. Sometimes architects are, they're sort of like jewelers. They want to just look at a piece of jewelry, but in actual fact, the role we can play can have much more impact.
Before the chair, Brian Kelly, has a chance to wrap up, I wanted to just mention a couple things that came to my mind really for the first time through the presentation. It's triggered by something you and I have chatted about a bit, which is the water rise isn't always in its ornery state, is going to, in its elevated state, be, rather kind of a nasty thing. It's brown, it's smelly. We talked about things floating, etc. But so that was the leaping point from my thought, and then I began to think, because you've given us such a great sense of time, has been mentioned here. That trace comes along with it, and landscapes are going to be quite a bit different than we're rendering. Again, not a criticism because, gosh, you've done so much here, but I'm as excited about imagining the trace of past, whenever you're near where you've seen floods, the high line leaves that dark trace of what was there, and then the layering of that on this, and this landscape no longer wanting to be manicured green, actually evolving and becoming a little gnarly and a few things disrupted. And eventually, I think if we can begin to depict time, not just in terms of action, but in trace and in, the richness that comes with that, and then how our aesthetics might engage that same patina. And I think of some of the current texts that are being written on weathering and, that sense of time. You've brought us so wonderfully to the frontier of our abilities to think across time. And I think that remains a little chapter for all of us to think about. If we can bring the joys and the power that come from these traces and how our aesthetics might commingle with that time is something you've left me with.
So Dan, that's an interesting point, because in your real hometown, not this hometown, but your town of birth, all throughout your town of birth, there are these benchmarks. And these benchmarks exist, and the ones that are most prominent are the ones from 1870, when the Tiber got out of control, and some said it was the result of political reasons, insulting the Pope by the unification of Italy. At any rate, so one could imagine that you could have a record all throughout the city of deluge. Before I talk to you, I'm going to just quickly say something to all the folks out here. I want to thank Garth for putting together a tremendous group of students to perform a ritual here that is really the culmination of the semester. Every semester, this activity is a very important activity, bringing in guests and alums to come talk and engage students. And I just really want to say this has been a great 2 days. I wish it were more, but then the spring will have many more days. So at any rate, I think it's important to thank all you guys, and I just think we should applaud Garth right now. So getting back to Daniel, this is a project that is really exploring the implications of a problem that exists at the global scale, at both the local and the regional scale. And really, it's a difficult problem. It's a problem that is not a soundbite. It's a problem that's all interrelated. Climate change and sea level rise doesn't care if you have bad hair and you're a Republican, or if you've got great hair and you're a Democrat. It doesn't really matter at all, right? It doesn't care. It's gonna take its toll and do what it wants to do, and we can pretend it's not gonna happen, or we can begin to develop responses. And I think that for me, the importance of the sectional drawings, the power of the sectional drawings and of these transformative drawings depicting places undergoing the siege of the water, and then the accepting of the water as a kind of new reality over time and the transformation has been very, very helpful to my understanding of how to respond to the problems. The stakeholders issue, I think, was a really good point that was made. And, this little sort of Hollywood squares over here of individuals are kind of highlighted, and oftentimes in theses or student projects, they're highlighted as kind of cameos for people that might be stakeholders, but maybe or maybe not the designer has ever really engaged with them. But I can tell you that it really shocked me, but Dan had an hour of time with the president of Salisbury University to discuss her desires to see a better Salisbury. He spent time with Jim Ireton, the former mayor, with Jake Day, the mayor, with Memo Drickard, with a whole series of people. Everybody that you see on the wall here have been people that he has he's acted like a sponge and mined things from them and brought their ideas to the table in a very successful way. And Andrea was mentioning, and unfortunately she had to leave, but there's one thing that most of us have been talking about is how this thesis deals with time. It deals with place and time simultaneously, and deals with the idea of time affecting change on place. And as Andrea was talking, I was just thinking about Dan, who I really know as a very facile designer and very serious individual. And I think his ability to deal with the temporal, and maybe I'm wrong about this, is directly related to his grasp of design thinking methodologies. And his willingness to always explore variations. He was never hampered by fixation and falling in love with a particular scheme, something that happens to so many of us, and we could all say this has all happened to us, where I like my design work, I don't want to change it. And Dan, every time you'd sit down with him and you'd give him a crit, there'd be a gazillion more of these things over on the side. And going into about 2 weeks ago, he was worried about generating all of this stuff, and from my perspective, it was like, well, worst case scenario, if the plotters break and you can't get this out of the box, you can just pin up all this other stuff and you still got a thesis. So, thank you very much, Dan. It's been a pleasure.